A photograph that breathes. The first time I saw the camera, it was wedged between a cracked ceramic vase and a stack of yellowed vinyl records in a second-hand shop that smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten years. It wasn't anything remarkable at first glance, a vintage black-bodied film camera, scuffed around the edges, the kind you'd imagine hanging around the neck of a war correspondent in some grainy documentary. But something about the lens, how it seemed darker than it should be, almost like a blind eye, held me there longer than I should have stayed. The tag said $10. I paid in crumpled bills, not knowing I was buying more than just an old camera. I loaded it with film that same night, the click of the shutter strangely satisfying, crisp in the dim silence of my apartment. The first shots were nothing special: my cluttered desk, a half-eaten sandwich, the view from my third-floor window where the streetlights hummed softly, flickering just out of sync. But when the developed photos arrived 3 days later, something felt off. The sandwich was still there, the desk too, but the window? The street below wasn't the same as the one I knew. The lights in the photo looked older, as if they belonged in a different decade. The lamppost was bent at a sharper angle. The sidewalk looked cracked, spiderwebbing in places I was sure were whole. And there was a figure standing just outside the pool of light, blurred, but clearly watching. I convinced myself it was a trick of the film. Bad development, maybe. Or an old roll with double exposures. I shot another roll that weekend, a few friends at a bar, the graffiti on the underpass, a self-portrait in the cracked mirror of my bathroom, where the silvering had started to peel away at the edges. When those photos came back, the distortion had spread. The faces of my friends were wrong. Smudged, almost like the lens had caught them mid-motion, though I knew they'd been still. Eyes too large, mouths twisted just slightly out of shape. The graffiti under the bridge had shifted, letters rearranged into something I couldn't read. And the self-portrait? At first, I thought it had been someone else's face staring back at me, the features blurred like water smeared across glass. But it was me. Just altered. My left eye seemed smaller, my jaw off-center, as though something inside the image was melting. That was when I noticed the breathing. It wasn't loud, not at first. More like the soft sound of a room settling in the night. But it didn't stop. And it wasn't in the room. It was inside the photographs themselves. A faint pulse, as if the paper were somehow alive. I threw the camera into a drawer. Locked it there beneath a pile of old receipts and manuals for things I didn't own anymore. But it didn't stay silent. I started hearing it at night. A soft click, like a shutter being pressed, from inside the drawer. Then the sound of film advancing. And then, the photographs changed again. The picture of my friends? Their faces weren't blurred anymore. They were gone. Just empty seats where they'd been, the drinks untouched. The bridge graffiti was clearer now, spelling out something crude, mocking, though I couldn't tell if the message was aimed at me or something else entirely. And the self-portrait. It wasn't me anymore. The figure had shifted. Taller. Darker. The face still mine but stretched, hollow-eyed, mouth wide as if caught mid-scream. I burned the photos. The fire stank of chemicals. But the next morning, another photo slid out from under my bedroom door. It was a picture of me. Taken while I slept. I didn't remember leaving the door unlocked. Hell, I didn't remember taking that photo at all. But there it was, the image crisp, the angle slightly tilted as if captured from the floor. My face looked pale, the shadows gathering too thick beneath my eyes. And something else, a faint blur just above my head, almost like a reflection on glass, except there was no glass in my bedroom. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling the skin at the back of my neck crawl, and then I did the only thing that made sense. I threw it in the trash, buried under coffee grounds and crushed beer cans, and slammed the lid so hard it echoed in the quiet. I didn't sleep much that night. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down in a way I couldn't explain. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, each passing car outside throwing unfamiliar shadows across the ceiling. At one point, I could have sworn I heard the click again, but this time from somewhere closer. Not the drawer. Not the trash. Right behind me. By morning, exhaustion dulled the edges of my thoughts, and I convinced myself it had all been a trick of the mind, fatigue, stress, maybe some bad food messing with my head. But then, just as I was leaving for work, I saw it. Taped to my door. Another photo. This time, it showed the hallway outside my apartment. The dim corridor stretching toward the stairwell, the peeling wallpaper, the flickering bulb overhead, all exactly as they were. Except for the figure. There was someone at the far end, just beyond the reach of the failing light. Tall, slightly hunched, with features blurred like they had been smudged into the grain of the photo. I couldn't see the eyes, but I felt them. Watching. The film camera was still in the drawer where I'd left it, untouched as far as I could tell. But the drawer felt colder now when I opened it, the air tinged with that chemical scent, sharp and metallic, like the bitter tang of old film developer. My hands trembled as I picked up the camera, turning it over slowly. The back was still sealed, the roll inside half used. So how? I developed the remaining shots the next day, my pulse pounding every time the machine whirred. The darkroom felt claustrophobic, the red glow staining my skin as the images appeared, slowly, like something being dredged up from black water. The first few were harmless enough, a corner of my kitchen, the view from my window, a book lying open on my desk. But the last frame, it wasn't possible. It showed me, standing at the sink. The exact clothes I wore that morning. The same tired slump of my shoulders. But there was something standing behind me in the frame, just out of focus, leaning over my shoulder like it was whispering something only the camera could hear. I stopped sleeping. Couldn't. Every sound made me jump. The shutter click haunted my dreams, snapping open in the dark spaces behind my eyelids, always too loud, too close. I checked the locks 5, 6 times a night, but the photos kept coming. Sliding under the door. Appearing on my nightstand. Tucked into the pages of books I hadn't touched in weeks. And every time, the figure grew clearer. It was never quite fully in frame, but the details sharpened, the edges of a face, skin stretched too tight, the mouth a ragged smear of black. Sometimes the photos captured places I hadn't been yet. Corners of the building I didn't recognize. An old stairwell I was sure had been sealed off months ago. And then, on a Tuesday, there was a photo of me standing in that same stairwell. Except I hadn't taken it. I hadn't even been there. I had the film developed again, desperate to understand. The technician gave me a strange look as he handed me the prints, the edges damp, the images a little too dark. The first 3 were mundane. The 4th showed my bathroom mirror, cracked again, but this time, my reflection was missing. The last photo wasn't dark at all. It was blinding white. And at the center, just barely visible in the overexposure, a hand. Reaching. I smashed the camera that night, shattered it against the edge of the sink until the lens cracked, the body split open with a hollow pop, the film spool unraveling like viscera. The fragments stared back at me from the floor, lifeless. The breathing stopped. For a while, I thought it was over. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the world holding its breath. Days passed without incident. No photographs appeared under my door. No phantom clicks in the night. The shadows in my room stopped shifting when the lights went out, and I told myself, again and again, that whatever had haunted me was gone. That destroying the camera had severed the thread, as if it had only been a bad dream that had finally released its grip. But there was a hollowness to that calm, as though something waited just beyond the edges of perception, watching. It was on the 10th night after I smashed the camera that the breathing returned. Soft at first, almost gentle, a low pulse beneath the stillness. I lay there in the dark, every muscle locked, heart hammering against my ribs as the sound deepened, growing rhythmic, deliberate. The sound wasn't in the room anymore. It was closer. Inside my head, pressing against the backs of my eyes, vibrating in my teeth. I woke to find a photograph on my pillow. This one was different. It wasn't grainy. It wasn't distorted. It was sharp, crystal clear, a perfect image of me, lying exactly as I had been, face pale, eyes shut, except for one thing. The figure was no longer behind me. It was above me. Its face hovered just inches from mine, skin pale as frost, the mouth twisted wide in a grotesque mockery of a smile. But the worst part wasn't the face. It was the eyes. They were my eyes, reflected back at me, as though the figure wore my own image like a mask. I didn't burn the photo this time. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly, and some small, sick part of me needed to know. Needed to see what would happen next. The next morning, the photo had changed again. It was still me. Still that awful, grinning reflection, but the mouth was whispering something now. The lips parted just enough to reveal teeth, sharp and too numerous. But the eyes were darker. Not black. Not empty. Just wrong, as though they weren't reflecting light but swallowing it. And behind me, faint but unmistakable, the outlines of other faces were beginning to emerge in the shadows. Familiar faces. My friends. The ones I'd photographed before. Except their features were hollowed out, the eyes like voids, as though something had been taken from them. I left the apartment. Couldn't stay there. Rented a cheap motel room on the other side of town where the wallpaper peeled and the carpet smelled faintly of mildew. I stuffed the photos in a drawer and kept the lights on all night. But the next morning, there they were again. On the nightstand. Neatly arranged. One more added to the set. The figure was closer now. Leaning in, its lips stretched impossibly wide, teeth sharp, eyes locked onto mine. And behind it, those faces, they weren't just watching anymore. They were screaming. And then, as I stared at the image, my reflection blinked. But I hadn't. I dropped the photo as if it burned me, the edges catching in my fingertips, the glossy surface slick with the sweat from my trembling hands. The blink hadn't been a trick. I knew what I saw, the reflection moving, independent of me, staring out of that frozen image with a hunger that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was trying to become. I tore through the motel room, tearing open every drawer, yanking the curtains shut tighter even though the daylight felt feeble, like it barely reached inside. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no messages. The world outside felt distant, unreal, a place I was no longer part of. My pulse hammered in my throat, and I kept telling myself to stay calm, to think, to make sense of the impossible, but the photo kept pulling my attention back, demanding to be seen. I tried to leave the room, shoving my keys into my pocket, clutching the doorknob with sweaty hands. But as I turned it, something clicked behind me. Not the door lock. Not the drawer. The sound came from the nightstand. There was a new photo. I hadn't taken it. The film was gone. The camera was destroyed. And yet, the photo lay there, perfectly centered, fresh. My heart clenched as I forced myself to look, the image so sharp it felt carved into my mind. It showed me, standing there at the motel door, keys in hand, face pale. But I wasn't alone anymore. The figure was standing behind me. Not blurred. Not distorted. Full. Clear. And it wasn't just wearing my face now. It was my face. I stumbled back, the photo clutched too tight, the edges digging into my skin as a new kind of fear surged, a sick, overwhelming certainty. It had been waiting for me to look. Waiting to be seen. And now it was. The breathing grew louder. Not outside. Not in my head. Inside the room. The lights dimmed as the shadows thickened, the edges pressing closer like the walls were folding in, and in the mirror above the desk, I saw it. My reflection. But it wasn't moving right, the head tilted too far, the eyes unblinking, the mouth twisting into something I couldn't call a smile. And then, slowly, the reflection raised a hand. Not to wave. To reach. I didn't think. I ran. The motel hallway felt endless, the flickering lights overhead stuttering as my footsteps echoed far too loud. Doors on either side. All closed. No sound. The world had gone silent except for the pounding of my pulse and that breathing, deeper now, slower, almost steady, like whatever followed me was drawing closer with every heartbeat. I hit the stairs at a full sprint, the air thick, pressing against my lungs, and halfway down I saw it. Another photo. Pinned neatly to the wall. My face again, this time in the stairwell, frozen mid-step, exactly where I stood. But my expression in the photo wasn't one of fear anymore. It was smiling. No. It was smiling. And in the reflection of the metal stair rail, distorted but unmistakable, the figure loomed behind me, closer than ever before. I ran. Out into the night. The rain had started, cold and biting, but I didn't care. My clothes soaked through in minutes, but nothing felt real anymore. Streetlights flickered, too dim to chase away the darkness pressing in from the edges of the city. Every window seemed to hold a reflection I couldn't quite trust. I didn't go home. Couldn't. But it didn't matter. The photos kept finding me. Folded into the pocket of my jacket. Slipped under my windshield wipers. Once, tucked inside a sandwich wrapper when I hadn't looked away from my plate for more than a moment. And in every shot, the figure wasn't behind me anymore. It was beside me. And its eyes weren't empty. They were mine. The last photo arrived 3 nights later, sealed inside a plain white envelope, slipped under the motel door. No handwriting. No markings. Just the image. I knew before I opened it. This time, it showed a door. My door. The apartment. And just visible through the peephole, distorted by the fisheye lens, a face. My face. Only the eyes were all wrong. And the breathing. I could hear it. Even before I opened the door. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. Some primal, ancient instinct screamed at me to step back, to leave, to run. But my hand moved on its own, trembling as it touched the cold metal of the doorknob. The rain still pounded outside, muffled against the walls of the dim motel room, but beneath it, closer now, the breathing persisted, steady, patient, louder than before, pressing into my ears as though it came from inside my head. The door creaked open, just an inch. Just enough to see. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Except for the photo. It was taped to the outside of the door, perfectly centered. I didn't want to look. I had to. It showed me standing there, exactly where I stood in that moment, the door half open, my face pale, lips slightly parted as though caught in the act of breathing in. But there was something else, too. Faint, almost hidden in the shadows behind me. A shape, just barely visible. Closer than before. I tore the photo from the door, but there was another underneath. The same image, but now the shape had stepped forward. No. Not a shape. A face. My face. I didn't move. Couldn't breathe. The silence was crushing now, pressing in as the air thickened. And then, behind me, from inside the room, a whisper. Look closer. I turned too fast, the world tilting. The mirror above the dresser. My reflection was waiting. But it wasn't mine anymore. It stood there, pale and still, watching. The expression twisted, the eyes darker, the mouth slowly curling into that wrong, hollow grin, teeth too sharp, too wide. And as I stared, unable to look away, the reflection raised its hand. So did I. It wasn't copying me. It was leading me. The hand moved closer to the glass, fingertips pressing lightly as though testing the barrier. And for one horrible moment, I saw something else, the surface rippling, faint but undeniable, as if the mirror wasn't solid anymore. As if it was breathing. I stumbled back, the photos crumpling in my hand, my mind racing for logic, for reason. But none of this made sense. The camera was gone. the film destroyed. And yet the photos kept coming. The reflection kept changing. I tried to fight it. Stayed awake for days, lights on, every reflective surface covered. But the photos still appeared. On my pillow. Tucked inside my shoes. Once, folded neatly inside a loaf of bread I hadn't even opened yet. And with each one, the reflection grew closer. Until the final photo came. It wasn't of me this time. It was a close-up. My eyes. But they weren't mine anymore. They were watching. And behind the glass, something else was watching too. I don't remember when I stopped seeing my own reflection. Or when it started seeing me.